The moon was a pale sliver in the dark Hyderabad sky. It hung there like a crooked smile, watching us. There were 4 of us. Rohan, the leader who was never scared of anything, Priya, who was smart and always had a flashlight, Samir, who jumped at every little sound, and me, Aman. I was the one who usually told the stories, but tonight we were about to walk into one. We stood at the bottom of Banjara Hills, staring up at the old house. The locals called it the House of Whispers. They said it was haunted. They said no one who went in after dark ever came out the same, and that, of course, was exactly why we were there. It was Rohan's idea, a dare born from a long, boring summer afternoon. One night, he had said, just one night to prove the stories are fake. Samir was already shivering, though the June night was warm and sticky. "Are you guys sure about this?" he whispered, his voice trembling like a leaf in the wind. "My grandmother told me that a family disappeared in there, just vanished." Priya clicked on her heavy-duty flashlight, cutting a bright line through the darkness. "Stories are just stories, Samir," she said, trying to sound brave. But I could see the way she clutched the flashlight, her knuckles white. We all knew the legends. They were told around campfires and in hushed tones at sleepovers. The house had been empty for 50 years, a dark shape against the city lights, waiting for someone foolish enough to accept its silent invitation. Rohan just laughed. It was a loud, confident sound that seemed out of place in the quiet night. "Don't be a baby, Samir. We'll go in, look around, and be back before midnight. What's the worst that could happen?" He started walking up the cracked, overgrown path, not even looking back to see if we were following. We had to follow. A dare was a dare. I took a deep breath, the air thick with the smell of jasmine and something else, something old and dusty, like an open grave. I looked at Priya, and she gave me a small, nervous nod. Together, we started our slow march toward the House of Whispers, our footsteps sounding like tiny heartbeats against the silent ground. We were just kids looking for a thrill. We thought we were brave. We thought we were in control. But some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. And as we got closer, the house seemed to grow larger, its dark windows like hollow eyes staring down at us. The wind picked up, rustling the dead leaves on the path, and it sounded like a soft hissing whisper. "Get out." Or maybe it was just the wind. I told myself it was just the wind. But deep down, a cold knot of fear was already tightening in my stomach. We were walking straight into the jaws of a nightmare, and none of us had any idea what was truly waiting for us inside. The house stood on the crest of the hill like a monster hunched against the stars. It was a colonial-era bungalow, but time had not been kind to it. The paint was peeling off in long, ghostly strips, revealing the dark wood underneath. Tangled vines crawled up the walls like bony fingers, clutching the crumbling bricks. The windows were dark, gaping holes, some with shattered glass that glittered like broken teeth in the moonlight. A large, gnarled banyan tree grew beside it, its aerial roots hanging down like a tangled mess of gray hair. The whole place looked sad and angry at the same time. It didn't just look empty, it looked hungry. It was the kind of house that you see in your worst dreams, the kind you run from but can never escape. As we reached the large iron gate, it let out a loud, groaning creak that echoed in the silence. The sound was like a painful moan. Rust flaked off onto our hands as Rohan pushed it open. The garden was a jungle. Weeds grew as tall as I was, and thorny bushes clawed at our jeans as we walked toward the front porch. The air grew colder here, a sudden drop in temperature that made the hairs on my arms stand up. It was like stepping into a refrigerator. "Did you feel that?" Samir stammered, his teeth chattering. Priya checked her watch, which had a thermometer. "That's weird," she said. "The temperature just dropped by 10 degrees. Rohan, of course, just shrugged it off, eager to get inside. The front door was massive, made of a dark, heavy wood with a giant brass handle shaped like a lion's head. The lion's face was frozen in a silent roar, its eyes seeming to follow us as we approached. It looked ancient and terrifying. Rohan reached out and grabbed the handle. It was ice cold, so cold that he pulled his hand back with a yelp. "It's freezing!" he exclaimed, looking at his hand as if it had been burned. This was the first time I saw a crack in his brave facade. For a moment, we all just stood there staring at the door. It was daring us, challenging us to turn the handle and step into the unknown world that lay beyond its heavy frame. With a deep breath, Rohan used the sleeve of his jacket to grip the handle this time. He turned it slowly. The lock inside made a series of loud, clunking sounds, like old bones snapping. Click, clunk, click. Then, with a long, low groan that sounded like a dying man, the door swung inward, opening into a pit of perfect blackness. A gust of wind rushed out from the house to greet us. It wasn't a normal wind. It smelled of dust, decay, and something else. Something faintly sweet, like forgotten perfume. It was the breath of the house, and it was inviting us in. We stood on the threshold, peering into the darkness, our adventure about to begin. We stepped inside, one by one, into the suffocating darkness of the grand foyer. Priya immediately switched on her flashlight, and the powerful beam cut through the gloom. The light revealed a huge, cavernous room. A grand staircase with a beautifully carved banister swept upwards into the shadows of the second floor. The floor was covered in a thick layer of gray dust, so thick that our footprints were the first to mark it in what looked like centuries. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling like ghostly chandeliers, swaying gently in the draft from the open door. Everything was covered in white sheets, making the furniture look like a gathering of lumpy ghosts standing silently in the dark, watching us. "Okay," Rohan said, his voice a little too loud, echoing strangely in the vast space. "Let's split up. Priya and I will check out the ground floor. Aman, you and Samir go check upstairs." Samir grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "No way," he squeaked. "We are not splitting up. That's how everyone gets into trouble in the movies." For once, I agreed with him. The idea of being separated in this place sent a shiver down my spine. The house felt too big, too dark, and too quiet. The silence was the worst part. It was a heavy, watchful silence, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for us to make a wrong move. Before we could argue more, a loud bang echoed from behind us. We all spun around in terror. The heavy front door had slammed shut on its own. We were plunged into complete darkness for a second before Priya could aim her flashlight at the door. Rohan ran to it and tried the handle. He pulled and pushed, but it wouldn't budge. "It's stuck!" he yelled, a note of real panic in his voice now. "It won't open!" We were trapped. The fun adventure had suddenly turned very, very real. The house had let us in, and now it wasn't going to let us out. The playful dare was over. We were prisoners of the House of Whispers. That's when we heard it for the first time. A faint sound coming from all around us. It was a soft, whispering sound, like the rustle of silk or dry leaves skittering across a floor. Shh. It seemed to slither out from the walls themselves. "Woo, are you?" The whisper was cold and raspy, and it seemed to echo inside my head. Samir let out a small whimper and hid behind Priya. Even Rohan stood frozen, his face pale in the flashlight's beam. The house was talking to us. The stories were true. We were not alone in the darkness, and whatever was with us was starting to get curious. "It's just the wind," Priya said, but her voice lacked conviction. The beam of her flashlight trembled as she swept it across the room, from one sheet-covered ghost to another. The whispers faded, leaving behind a silence that felt even heavier than before. We huddled together in the center of the foyer, a small island of frightened kids in a vast ocean of darkness. The decision was made without a single word. We were sticking together. We had to find another way out. "There must be a back door," Rohan said, his bravado returning, though it sounded forced. "Let's check the kitchen." He pointed the way with a shaky finger, down a long, dark corridor to our left. We moved as a single unit, our footsteps crunching in the thick dust. Every creak of the floorboards under our feet sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive quiet. The corridor was lined with portraits on the walls. As Priya's light passed over them, stern-faced men and women in old-fashioned clothes seemed to stare at us, their painted eyes following our every move. It felt like we were being judged by the silent, long-dead inhabitants of the house. I could have sworn that one of the portraits, a woman in a black dress, blinked as the light moved away. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a figment of my overactive imagination. But the feeling of being watched was intense. Suddenly, we heard a sound from upstairs. Thump, thump, thump. It was a slow, heavy sound, like someone was dragging a heavy piece of furniture across the floor. Or maybe, my mind whispered, like someone was dragging a body. We froze, our hearts pounding in our chests. The sound stopped as abruptly as it had started. We waited, holding our breath, listening. The silence that followed was terrifying. "What was that?" Samir whispered, his eyes wide as saucers. Rohan shook his head, trying to look brave. "Probably just the house settling," he said. "It's an old house, that's all." But none of us believed him. We all knew that wasn't a normal sound. Deciding to ignore the noise from upstairs for now, we continued down the hallway towards where we thought the kitchen would be. As we passed a closed door, we heard another sound from inside the room. It was the faint, tinkling melody of a music box. It was a sweet, childish tune, but in that dark, decaying house, it sounded horrifying. It was the kind of music you'd hear in a nightmare. The tune was slow and sad, and it felt completely out of place. It was a sound of life in a house that felt so dead. Who would be playing a music box in an abandoned house in the middle of the night? We stopped, staring at the door, the creepy melody seeping into our bones. The music box melody continued its ghostly tune, beckoning us. Curiosity, that dangerous human trait, got the better of us. Rohan reached for the doorknob. It was old and brass, and it turned with a rusty squeal. He pushed the door open, and Priya shone her flashlight inside. The room was a child's nursery. In the center of the room was a small wooden rocking horse covered in dust. A crib stood in the corner, its bars like a tiny cage. The music was coming from a small silver music box on a dusty dresser, but the lid was closed. The music was playing on its own. We stared, mesmerized and terrified. As we watched, the rocking horse began to move. It started slowly, just a tiny rock back and forth. Then it picked up speed, rocking faster and faster, its wooden runners making a rhythmic creak thump on the floorboards. But no one was touching it. Samir screamed, a high-pitched shriek that was quickly swallowed by the shadows. The rocking motion was violent, angry. It was as if an invisible, frustrated child was riding it. We backed away slowly, our eyes glued to the phantom rider on the horse. The music from the box grew louder and more frantic, matching the pace of the rocking. Then, the shadows in the room began to move. This was not the normal play of light and dark from Priya's flashlight. The shadows on the wall detached themselves and began to dance. They stretched and twisted into strange, unnatural shapes. One shadow looked like a tall, thin man with long arms. Another looked like a crouching animal. They swirled and twirled on the walls, a silent, terrifying ballet. It was like the very darkness of the house had come alive. They seemed to be reaching for us, their dark, shadowy fingers stretching across the floor, getting closer and closer. We were frozen in place, unable to scream, unable to run. Suddenly, the music box stopped. The rocking horse came to a sudden, jarring halt. The shadows froze on the wall. For a moment, there was complete and utter silence. Then, a child's giggle echoed through the room. It was a cold, cruel sound that had no humor in it. It came from the empty crib in the corner. That was what finally broke our paralysis. Rohan slammed the door shut, and we didn't stop running. We fled down the corridor, away from the nursery, away from the giggling, away from the dancing shadows. We ran blindly, deeper into the house, our only thought to get as far away as possible from that horrible room. We finally stopped running when we stumbled into what must have been the main dining hall. It was a massive room with a long wooden table in the center, large enough to seat 20 people. The chairs were all neatly tucked in, as if waiting for phantom guests to arrive for dinner. A huge, dusty chandelier hung above the table, its crystals sparkling faintly in Priya's light. We were all breathing heavily, our chests burning. "Okay," Priya said, panting. "Okay, that was not normal." No one argued with her. The image of the rocking horse and the dancing shadows was burned into our minds. We were all truly scared now. As we stood there trying to catch our breath, I felt it again. The same intense cold we had felt in the garden, but this time it was concentrated in one spot, right in the middle of the room. It was a pillar of icy air. I walked into it and it was like stepping into a freezer. My breath turned to white mist in front of my face. "Guys, over here!" I called out, my voice shaking. "It's freezing right here." They came over and one by one they stepped into the cold spot. Samir yelped and jumped back out. "It's like ice!" he exclaimed, rubbing his arms. Priya, ever the scientist, pointed her flashlight at the spot. The beam seemed to flicker and warp as it passed through the cold air. "There's no draft," she said, looking up at the ceiling and at the boarded-up windows. "There's no reason for it to be this cold right here. It's impossible." As she spoke, a faint, wispy shape began to form in the cold spot. It was a translucent, shimmering mist, slowly swirling and taking on a vaguely human form. It was like watching a ghost materialize right in front of our eyes. It was faint, but it was there. A tall, slender figure made of cold air and moonlight. We couldn't make out any features, but we could feel its presence. It felt sad. A deep, profound sadness seemed to radiate from the shape, a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. It was the cold of loneliness and sorrow. The whispers started again, but this time they were different. They weren't menacing. They were soft and filled with pain. "So cold," the voice sighed, seeming to come from the misty shape itself. "Always so cold." We weren't just in a haunted house. We were in a sad house. The ghost wasn't trying to scare us. It was trying to tell us something. It was in pain, and it was trapped. The sad, misty figure slowly faded away, and the intense cold dissipated with it, leaving us shivering in the normal chill of the house. We stood in silence for a long time, the ghost's sorrowful whisper echoing in our ears. The fear was still there, a cold lump in our stomachs, but now it was mixed with something else. Pity. We weren't just trespassers in a scary place anymore. We were witnesses to someone's eternal suffering. Rohan, who had been so loud and confident before, was quiet. He just stared at the spot where the figure had been, his face pale and thoughtful. The dare felt childish and cruel now. We knew we still had to find a way out. We decided to try the back of the house, hoping for a kitchen door or a window we could break. We moved cautiously through a series of smaller rooms, a library with empty shelves, a study with an overturned desk. The feeling of being watched never left us. It was as if hundreds of unseen eyes were following our every step. We finally came to a room at the very back of the house. The door was slightly ajar. Priya pushed it open, and the beam of her flashlight revealed something that made my blood run cold. The walls were covered from floor to ceiling with painted eyes, hundreds of them. Big eyes, small eyes, wide eyes, narrow eyes. They were painted in stark black and white, and they were all staring directly at us. It was a dizzying, terrifying sight. It felt like the entire house was looking at us from this one room. As we stared, horrified, the eyes on the wall began to blink. Not all at once, but one after another, in a sickening, random pattern. Blink, blink, blink. They were alive. The painted eyes were watching us, and they were blinking. Samir let out a choked sob and covered his own eyes as if that could make them go away. In the center of the room was a single wooden chair, and on it sat a dusty old diary. Compelled by a force I didn't understand, I walked towards it, my legs feeling like lead. I felt the painted eyes follow me. I picked up the diary. The leather was cracked and dry. I opened it to a random page. The handwriting was elegant but shaky. It was the diary of a young woman who had lived in the house long ago. I read a single sentence written in faded ink. "He is always watching. His eyes are everywhere. I can't escape his gaze. Even the walls have his eyes." The words in the diary sent a fresh wave of terror through me. The eyes on the wall weren't just paintings, they were a manifestation of someone's fear and paranoia. This house wasn't just haunted by a sad ghost, it was possessed by a dark, watchful presence. As I stood there holding the diary, the blinking eyes on the walls all focused on me. Every single one of them swiveled to stare directly into my soul. The feeling was so intense, so malevolent, that I dropped the diary with a cry. Priya rushed to my side, grabbing my arm. "Aman, what is it? What did it say?" she asked, her voice urgent. Before I could answer, a new sound filled the house. It started as a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. It was a deep, angry sound, unlike the sad whispers or the child's giggle. This was pure rage. The growl grew louder and louder, coming from the floor below us, or maybe from the walls themselves. The entire house seemed to tremble with its fury. The painted eyes on the walls began to weep a thick black substance that looked like ink or tar. Black tears rolled down the walls, streaking the plaster and filling the room with a foul chemical smell. "We have to get out of here, now!" Rohan yelled, finally snapping out of his apathetic state. He grabbed a loose floorboard from a corner of the room and ran towards the nearest window. It was boarded up with thick planks of wood. He began to smash the board against the window with all his might. Crack! Smash! The sound of splintering wood mixed with the terrifying growl that now surrounded us. We huddled behind him, Priya keeping the flashlight aimed at his work, while Samir and I watched the black tears dripping from the hundreds of watching eyes. The house was angry that we had discovered its secrets. It was angry that we had read the diary. With a final, mighty crash, Rohan broke through the boards and shattered the window pane. Cold, fresh night air flooded into the room, a welcome relief from the stale, foul air of the house. The opening was small, but it was big enough. "Go! Go now!" Rohan shouted. Priya scrambled through first, then helped a whimpering Samir. I was next. As I climbed through the jagged opening, I looked back one last time. In the center of the room, a tall, dark shadow was rising from the floor, a figure of pure darkness with no face, only a sense of overwhelming hatred. As I tumbled out onto the damp grass outside, a terrible, deafening scream erupted from the house, a sound of pure agony and rage that seemed to shake the very foundations of the hill. We didn't stop running until we reached the bottom of the hill, until the iron gates were far behind us. We collapsed onto the pavement under the orange glow of a streetlight, gasping for air, our bodies covered in scratches and dust. We didn't talk. We couldn't. The horrible scream from the house still echoed in our ears. We just sat there, huddled together, until the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and orange. The new day felt like a miracle. It felt like we had survived the longest, darkest night of our lives. The House of Whispers looked different in the morning light. It looked smaller, less menacing. It just looked like an old, sad, broken-down house. We walked home in silence, the city of Hyderabad slowly waking up around us. The sounds of traffic and morning prayers were the most beautiful things I had ever heard. They were sounds of normalcy, sounds of life. When I got home, my parents were still asleep. I crept into my room, my heart still pounding. I looked at myself in the mirror. I was pale and my eyes were wide, but I was safe. The dare seemed so stupid now, so pointless. We had gone looking for a cheap thrill, a story to tell our friends. Instead, we had stumbled into a place of real pain, real sorrow, and real evil. The lesson we learned that night was a simple one, but it was one we would never forget. Some doors are meant to stay closed. Some stories are not meant to be lived. We had been arrogant and foolish, thinking that the world's mysteries were just games for us to play. But the universe is full of things we don't understand, shadows that are deeper and darker than we can imagine. The House of Whispers had taught us respect. Respect for the unknown, respect for the dead, and respect for the stories that warn us to stay away. It wasn't about being brave or cowardly. It was about being wise. We never spoke about what happened in that house again. Not to each other, not to anyone. There were no words to describe it, but I knew we were all changed. Rohan was quieter, more thoughtful. Samir strangely seemed less jumpy, as if having faced a real horror made the small things less scary. And me? I still tell stories, but I'm much more careful about the ones I choose to enter. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls outside my window, I think I can hear a faint whisper on the breeze. And I remember the eyes on the wall, the sad, cold ghost, and the final terrible scream. And I know with absolute certainty that we were lucky to get out alive.